Big Shaq, dressed in a simple white t-shirt, steps out of a mall, enjoying a peaceful afternoon. As he walks toward his sleek black sports car, a racist cop suddenly blocks his way, accusing him of stealing the vehicle. Words turn into heated insults, and when Shaq calmly defends himself, the officer, blinded by arrogance and pride, swings his baton. But the moment the baton moves, everything changes. Subscribe and like this video to see how this story unfolds. The bright sun shines over the high-end mall, casting golden light on the sidewalks. People move in and out, busy with their shopping. Among all the cars parked outside, one stands out, a sleek black luxury sports car parked near the entrance. Into this lively scene steps Big Shaq. His strong build makes him impossible to miss, but today, he's just a regular guy enjoying a day out. A small shopping bag dangles from his hand, and a satisfied smile spreads across his face. His eyes sparkle with happiness like a kid in a candy store. "Man, I still love a good shopping day," he mutters to himself, enjoying the simple pleasure of picking out things he likes. Even with his legendary career and fame, Shaq has always found joy in everyday moments, like strolling through stores and treating himself. But just as he reaches his car, ready for his next adventure, someone suddenly steps in front of him. A tall, muscular officer with a face as hard as stone stands in his way. Officer Brian. His towering presence is a sharp contrast to Shaq's relaxed mood. His expression is cold and unreadable, but the glint in his eyes hints at trouble. His rough voice slices through the air. "Whoa, whoa," he says, stopping Shaq in his tracks. "Where do you think you're going?" His tone is sharp, filled with authority and something else. Something less friendly. The air feels heavy. The officer's presence is like a weight pressing down on Shaq. Shaq's brows furrow slightly in confusion. To my car?" he responds, his voice carrying a hint of uncertainty. It's such a simple question, but in this moment, it feels like a test. A tense silence hangs between them. Then Officer Brian smirks, his lips curling in amusement. "That's your car?" he asks, pretending to sound surprised. On the surface, it seems like an innocent question, but underneath there's a hidden insult. Like he's saying, Shaq doesn't look like someone who could own a car like this. The officer's words hit like a snake's bite, quick and sharp. He slowly looks Shaq up and down, his eyes narrowing in judgment. Then he chuckles, shaking his head. "That's funny," he mutters, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't usually see guys like you driving something this nice." His stare feels like an attack, an open display of racism. His fake curiosity is just a cover for his real message. You don't belong here. As their conversation grows more intense, the tension spreads. The people walking through the parking lot start to notice. Some slow down, turning their heads toward the scene. A quiet ripple of unease moves through the crowd. Something is about to happen. A couple, originally focused on their shopping, suddenly got distracted. Their curiosity was sparked by the sight of a former boxing champion squaring off against a large police officer. Their faces showed a mix of fascination and concern, mirroring the tension now filling the air. Shaq, determined to stay calm despite Brian's hostility, held up his keys. The soft jingle of metal against metal emphasized his words. "Yeah, it's mine," he said, his voice steady and controlled. His tone showed his self-control and patience. "Got the keys right here," he continued, his words quiet but firm, the sound of the keys a silent challenge to the officer's doubts. Even in this tense moment, Shaq carried himself with dignity. He refused to sink to Brian's level, showing strength in his character. Officer Brian, his face hard with anger, crossed his arms, his posture stiff with hostility. "Keys don't mean a thing," he shot back, his voice sharp. "I've seen plenty of carjackers holding stolen keys." The accusation was unfair, clearly meant to provoke Shaq into reacting, something that would give Brian an excuse to take things further. The officer's smug words made it clear. Even in broad daylight with a crowd watching, The law was not on Shaq's side. Shaq took a slow breath, his patience wearing thin. "Look, officer," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "I don't want any trouble, but this car's registered in my name. You can check if you want." Though his tone remained respectful, there was no mistaking the frustration underneath. The unfairness of the situation weighed on him, threatening to push him past his limit. Brian, sensing Shaq's growing irritation, let out a mocking laugh. The sound sent a chill through Shaq's spine. "Funny," he sneered, smirking. "I don't take orders from thugs." The insult was a clear act of racism and abuse of power. It hit Shaq hard, but he refused to let Brian see him crack. "You don't look like someone who legally owns a car like this," Brian added, his words like a knife aimed at Shaq's pride. The crowd gasped in unison, their shock clear in the sharp intake of breath. Shaq, bracing himself against the stream of insults, clenched his jaw. The tension was clear in the tight lines of his face. Despite the anger burning inside him, he stayed in control. Like an athlete on the court, he dodged Brian's verbal attacks, waiting for the right moment to respond. Brian, emboldened by Shaq's restraint, stepped closer, the gap between them shrinking. His stance was tense, his presence threatening, the air around them thick with danger. "Step away from the car, tough guy," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. "Hands where I can see them," he added, his words carrying the weight of authority and the silent threat of force. Shaq exhaled, placing his shopping bag on the car's hood. His posture was a mix of surrender and defiance. "Officer, I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. Even as he tried to de-escalate, his feet stayed firmly planted. He would not let Brian intimidate him. He would not back down in the face of injustice. Brian, ignoring Shaq's attempt at peace, smirked cruelly, ready to push him even further. "Yeah," he sneered, his voice full of mockery. "Well, you found one." The officer's words dripped with venom and contempt as he taunted the former champion. In Brian's mind, Shaq's fame and achievements meant nothing. To him, the basketball player was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. Another criminal just waiting to mess up. Without warning, Officer Brian swung his baton. The weapon cut through the air, aiming straight for Shaq's ribs. The crowd gasped, their shocked voices filling the air as they watched the scene unfold. But before the baton could land, something unbelievable happened. With lightning-fast reflexes, Shaq twisted to the side, and the blow glanced harmlessly off his shoulder. Years of training had sharpened his movements to perfection, and with the grace of a panther, he dodged the strike. Adrenaline surged through him as he stepped back, just out of Brian's reach. "Whoa," Shaq said, his voice a mix of surprise and amusement. "That's how we do things now." His words hung in the air, dripping with sarcasm. Even with all his size and strength, Shaq had never lost the quick wit that had served him well on the court. Now he used it to show just how ridiculous Brian's actions were. Shaq's movement was like poetry, smooth and effortless. The baton swiped past him, missing its target completely. Brian, thrown off balance by his own force, stumbled forward. For a moment he teetered, his aggression working against him. But Shaq, always alert, saw his opening. Brian, his pride wounded, glared at Shaq with a mix of rage and frustration. His grip on the baton tightened until his knuckles turned white. "Think you're fast, huh?" he snarled. The words were a challenge, a clear attempt to provoke him. Brian, blinded by arrogance and prejudice, had stepped far beyond his authority. He wasn't a law enforcer anymore. He was an attacker. Consumed by fury, Brian swung again. The baton sliced through the air like a striking snake, aimed directly at Shaq's shoulder. But Shaq was ready. With a move so fast it seemed impossible, he snatched the baton mid-swing, stopping it cold in his hand. The crowd gasped in awe. Phones were pulled out in seconds, eager to record this moment. Shaq, now holding the baton with ease, let out a soft chuckle, his eyes filled with quiet amusement. With a calm but firm voice, he spoke. "Officer, I don't know what your problem is," he said, his words steady and controlled. But I'd suggest you chill out before you embarrass yourself. His tone was both a warning and a sign of mercy. Brian, his face red with anger and humiliation, yanked at the baton, trying to take it back. "Let go, punk!" he barked, his voice shaking with frustration. But Shaq's grip was like iron. The baton didn't budge. It was a symbol. Shaq was in control now. Brian's panic showed in his eyes as he fought against the moment slipping away from him. Then, with a flick of his wrist, Shaq let go. The force sent Brian stumbling backward, his own weight and pride working against him. The crowd gasped again, their disbelief clear in every breath. Shaq, now fully grinning, stood tall, his body language screaming confidence. As the crowd slowly realized who the man at the center of the scene was, a wave of recognition spread through them. "Is that Big Shaq?" someone whispered, their voice filled with a mix of shock and excitement. Others, their eyes wide with surprise, began whispering to each other, exchanging looks of amazement. Brian, still unaware of Shaq's fame, thought the crowd's reaction was more disrespect toward him. His anger boiled over. But Shaq, unfazed by the chaos building around him, stood firm, his eyes locked onto the officer with unshaken focus. Brian, still gripping his baton tightly, started to sense the shift in the air. The murmurs from the crowd reached his ears, making him pause. His fingers loosened just slightly as doubt crept into his mind. Like a storm forming in the distance, his confidence wavered, the reality of the situation settling in like a sudden chill. Shaq's voice was calm but carried a force that sent shivers down Brian's spine. "You know," he said, his tone steady but powerful, "I've spent my whole life fighting. Not just on the court, but out here too. I've seen people like you before. Always looking down on others, always thinking you're better." His words weren't just a challenge. They were a lesson, exposing Brian's prejudice for all to see. The officer, his grip now tight like a vice, trembled with the frustration of someone who felt cornered. He tried to keep his composure, but Shaq's words had cut deep, shaking him to his core. Brian's breath came in short, uneven gasps. His jaw tightened as he fought to regain control, but his fingers twitched like live wires. His confidence was cracking, the weight of his mistake crashing down on him like thunder in a silent night. Sensing the shift in power, Shaq leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping to a quiet but dangerous tone. "Let me tell you something," he murmured, his words carrying the weight of a promise. "When you pick a fight with the wrong man, sometimes you don't get back up the same." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. He stood there still and steady, like a storm waiting to strike. The crowd, no longer whispering, started to speak louder, their voices rising in realization. Brian's face turned pale as understanding hit him. His eyes widened in shock. "You're Big Shaq," he stammered, his voice cracking. He suddenly felt small, trapped in a situation spinning out of his control. Shaq's smirk was subtle but sharp, like a blade cutting through Brian's fear. "Now you get it," he said, his voice laced with triumph. He was done holding back. His cold smile hinted at the energy crackling around him, the kind of power that could explode at any second. And yet, even with this growing danger, Shaq stayed calm, like a predator playing with its prey. Brian, his eyes darting around, noticed the smartphones, their cameras locked on him, like the eyes of 100 hungry vultures. He swallowed hard as the reality of his situation hit him like a heavy, crushing weight. Slowly, so very slowly, he lowered the baton, his hand shaking as he did. The crowd, sensing his surrender, began to whisper excitedly. They could feel it, the fall of the bully. But Brian didn't move. He just stood there, his pride now nothing but a broken shell of what it once was. Big Shaq's voice rang out, sharp and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife through butter. "Now, are we done here, officer?" His words weren't just a question, they were a challenge, daring Brian to respond. Shaq stood tall, ready for anything, waiting for the slightest excuse, the tiniest bit of defiance that would make him unleash his fury. But Brian, his spirit crushed, simply nodded in defeat, a small, pathetic gesture that saved him from further embarrassment. His face filled with shame, Brian turned without saying a word. He walked toward his patrol car quickly, like a wounded animal retreating to safety. The moment his car door shut behind him, the crowd erupted into cheers and laughter. Their joy wasn't just about Shaq's victory, it was a loud, undeniable rejection of Brian's prejudice. Shaq stood in the middle of the chaos, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face. It was the perfect ending to an unforgettable moment. Soon, this scene would be replayed over and over across social media, a viral sensation in the making. With a tired sigh, Shaq shook his head, the weight of the situation settling on him like a heavy cloak. The crowd's laughter still rang in his ears, a bittersweet reminder of how ridiculous all of this was. He had been in situations like this too many times before. Walking to his car, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his keys, and unlocked the door. Just as he slid into the driver's seat, a bystander, still buzzing from the excitement, ran up to him. "Man, that was legendary," he said, his grin wide with admiration. Shaq, still processing everything, gave him a small smile. But before he could respond, another bystander stepped forward, his face full of gratitude. "Hey, Mr. Shaq," he said sincerely. "Thanks for handling that the way you did." A smirk played on Shaq's lips, a touch of humor in his voice. "Yeah, well, he's lucky I've mellowed out over the years," he said, a sly nod to his younger, more fiery self. The crowd burst into laughter again, their admiration for Shaq growing even more. Even in retirement, he still had that sharp wit that made people love him. As the laughter died down, they watched Shaq slide into the driver's seat. With the same effortless confidence he always had, Shaq buckled up and started the engine. The car roared to life. He gave the crowd one last wave before driving away, the last traces of the confrontation fading in the distance. From a bird's-eye view, the camera captured the scene before slowly fading to black. It stood as a silent witness to the end of an unexpected story. If you enjoyed the story, share it with your loved ones, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories.